Well, good evening, everybody. Uh, Tonight, we're going to talk a bit about church and politics in an election year in light of some of the material we've talked about in the previous weeks on Catholic social thought. And I thought I'd begin very quickly with just situating the church on the issue of democracy, because I think you can say that the Catholic Church went through in the modern, what I'm going to call the modern era. Now, this is modern in the perspective of the Catholic Church. Most
Excuse
people
me, Ken. I've got to go and change this to the speaker view. My apologies.
That's
Let me
correct.
get this. That's better for the. So let me put this back. Sorry about that. Okay, we're all set. Okay, good. Sorry.
So that's quite all right. So
Okay.
the modern era, basically, when the Catholic Church thinks modernity, it's thinking basically around the period of the French Revolution. That's what they consider the entrance into modernity. But as you might imagine, because of the papacy, Catholicism has largely been sort of affiliated with monarchical institutions and seen to be akin to secular governments that were monarchical. And so after the French Revolution, and equally troubling to the Catholic Church, was the rise of Italian nationalism. We keep thinking of the Vatican as that little sort of theme park in the middle of Rome that you can visit like a tourist, and it's just a little postage stamp in Italy. But at one time, well up until really the late 19th century, the Vatican State was a good deal of the middle of Europe. Much of what we think of today as Tuscany and those areas were all part of the Papal States and were controlled by the Pope as a secular ruler of those areas. And so when Italian nationalism arises, and there's an effort to unite all these disparate regions that made up the Italian peninsula, part of that was going to be the seizure of the Papal States. And that, as well as the French Revolution, left a fairly bitter taste, you might say, in the mouth of the Vatican as to what democracy lent itself to. In the minds of Rome or of the Vatican, democracy was just a nice word for mob rule, as far as they looked at it. It unleashed chaos, because that's sort of how they saw the French Revolution, and that's sort of how they evaluated the movement of Italian nationalism and the unification of the Italian peninsula. And so there was you could say that the papacies of Gregory XVI and Pius IX, who were the two long popes in the 1800s, the first half of the 19th century was pretty much taken up by those two popes and their papacies. They saw democracy as threatening, and they were no supporters of it. And they sort of maintained the view that Catholics really could not participate in democracies. With the arrival of Leo XIII in the 1870s, and then following him, Pius X, Benedict XV, Pius XI, what you get, these are popes who take us from 1878, when Leo XIII becomes pope, on up through and into the 1930s with Pius XI. So during that roughly 50, 60 years of time, you see the Catholic Church beginning to react with what I'm saying is ambivalence. That is, democratic regimes are spreading in European politics, and parliamentary systems are arising as the dominant form of governance in many of these European nations. And you begin to see that the church starts to express an openness to democracy. It's just that. There's no great enthusiasm for democracy, but the church and the papacy in particular does not want to seem to be simply out of touch with these emerging social movements. And so therefore, they begin to talk about models of governance that may be different than a monarchical regime, right? And then with Pius XII on up through the popes that we would all know from our own growing up, John the 23rd, Paul VI, John Paul, Benedict, and Francis. With these popes, you see democracy gets more than ambivalence. Democracy is actually endorsed. And one of the big motives for this is the experience of World War II. That is what they saw with the rise of National Socialism in Germany and then Austria, the rise of fascism in Italy with Mussolini. But they also, and importantly, with the rise of the Bolsheviks in Russia and the rise of the communist regimes under Lenin and then Stalin especially, you begin to see the papacy realize that the choice is no longer monarchy versus or aristocracy versus democracy. It's becoming democracy versus authoritarian, even tyrannical regimes. And so you see the papacy clearly making a choice under Pius XII and later popes that democracy is judged to be the most appropriate form of government. And this continues with the emergence of decolonization. As the European nations after World War II begin to pull back from the various colonial regimes that they sponsored and ran and operated in, especially in Africa and Asia, to a lesser extent than Central and Latin America. But as decolonization happens, and the yearning for democracy is seen in many of these new countries and new nations that are coming to be, you see the papacy moving from just kind of lukewarm ambivalence to genuine endorsement of democracy. Now, interestingly enough, they do not say that democracy is the ideal form of government. There's no claim that democracy is forever and for always in all situations the way to run a country. But what they begin to talk about is, given our understanding of the world today and people's interest in being self-determining, that was largely the decolonization agenda, but also the demand for personal freedom and for greater participation in self-governance that you see after World War II and in the reaction to fascism, Nazism, and also communism as it begins to grow in Eastern Europe. You see the papacy sort of saying, without making claims that forever and always democracy is the ideal, you see the judgment being made that democracy is what Pius XII said, the most apt form of government. That's about as strong as the endorsement becomes, that it's the most appropriate form of government in this time and in this age that we're living in. So that's just a little background in terms of how we begin to think about democracy and elections, to recognize the church took a while to adjust and to come around to accepting democracy as a system of government that would seem to be the favored or preferable one.
And we've gone about 8 minutes, Ken, so just finishing up this one.
Okay. So just let me just rattle off a few things to give you a sense of where we are in terms of U.S. Catholicism. Who are we? Well, some of these numbers, they're estimates, and that's about the best you can get. But roughly, we're talking about the Catholic population in the United States is about 52 million people. That's about 23% of the population. So a little less than 1 out of 4 Americans, US residents, is Catholic. 1/3 of that 52 million are people of Hispanic origin. Right now, the Catholic population is the largest of all religious groups in the United States. That's been the case for more than 100 years, that Catholics have been the largest single religious body in the United States. What has evolved over time is Catholics, especially Catholics of Western European descent, have some of the highest levels of formal education and highest income levels within the United States. As regards institutions, we all know that there's been a sea change in terms of the parochial school system, but the Catholic parochial school system is still the second largest educational system in the United States after public schools. There are still around 5,900 or so Catholic grammar schools and high schools, educating roughly 1.7 million people, 1,700,000 students. There are still about 180 Catholic institutions of higher education, colleges and universities. There are about 750,000 college students in Catholic institutions, about 725,000. The Catholic Church is still the largest non-governmental social service agency in the United States, serving the domestic population of the United States, with the largest non-governmental social service agency. In terms of international relief and international aid, Catholic institutions are the second largest non-governmental organization providing international relief. And to put it in business terms, despite all the parish closings and mergers and everything else, there's still about 16,000 Catholic franchises out there. If you want to think about the average local parish as a franchise, there's still about 16,000 Catholic parishes in the United States. So the point is simply, we are a substantial group of people, and we have a substantial institutional presence in the life of US society. With that, and we can go to the next slide, Dave. With that, it's useful to think about, well, what's the strategy we should follow in terms of thinking about how should this Catholic people and these Catholic institutions, how should they operate in public? What difference should the Catholic Church make in the wider society? Remember last week we ended with some thoughts about this idea of a public church. What's the strategy for a public church in the United States? And here I simply just want to break that down into manageable bites. It seems to me we need to think about ideas, that is, what people think. We need to think about institutions, which we can think of as those organizations or associations that put ideas into practice, that operationalize ideas. And then third, communities or groups of people who will provide support for these institutions. Now, talking about ideas, unless politics has some sort of overarching vision, unless there is some sort of overarching vision of life or about what a good society is, then politics without some sort of vision simply becomes, it's just a place that tries to broker individual self-interest. What religion does for public life at its best is it reminds us that policy choices should be addressed in terms of moral values, as well as other criteria, efficiency, effectiveness, financial constraints, and the like. Not to dismiss these other elements, but it's the religious vision that keeps inserting and interjecting the moral component into public policy. Religion reminds us that we're engaged in politics for the sake of creating not only a well-ordered society, but a just one. That politics is not just simply about who gets to stick their hand into the public purse. It's also about trying to order a society in a fair and just way. And paramount in the church's role in this, in trying to help think about public ideas, is the shaping of public opinion. Public opinion, it seems to me, serves at least two roles in American democracy. On the one level, it provides support for necessary policies. Someone once said to me when I was living in Washington that politicians are like doctors. No doctor wants to be the first to prescribe a medication, but no doctor wants to be the last to prescribe a medication. And it's the same thing with politicians. It's the rare politician who wants to be the first to come out with an idea or propose a policy and go out on a limb without knowing that there are other people going to crawl out there with him or her. At the same time, no politician wants to be so behind the curve of public opinion that they're the last person to come on board with an idea. And so one of the important things of public opinion is it gives policymakers and politicians, it gives them the space to actually do something. It provides the context within which they can begin to think of this policy proposal is thinkable. It's within reason. I'll get some support and backing if I'm for this. So that's an important role for public opinion, providing necessary support for people who are proposing policies. At the other way of thinking about public opinion is it puts constraints or limits on policy. That is, a politician that comes out with some viewpoint that is so far outside of the mainstream immediately marginalizes themselves in terms of getting something done. You need to have at least a segment of the public who will stand with you and support you in doing something. And you also want to avoid running afoul of a majority of views in public opinion when you're proposing something. So that this is the importance of cultivating public opinion in a democracy, because basically public opinion makes possible what is feasible and what is unlikely in terms of a political agenda. It's not to say that public opinion is always wise. It's not to say that it's always ethically sound, but it's simply to recognize that one aspect of a representative democracy is that we don't simply translate public opinion into policy, but rather public opinion shapes the atmosphere or the environment within which public officials are going to debate and discuss what's possible. There may be a spectrum of views that are out there and seen to be feasible options, but there are some options which are judged to be too far outside the range of public opinion that politicians will quickly move away from them and not want to put their reputation on the line in supporting them. So that the task of trying to form intelligent, reasonable public opinion, one that provides both directions for policymakers as well as puts limits or restraints on policymakers, that's a vital role for religious communities to help shape public opinion. Now, Jesus, if he were alive today, and if Jesus walked into the pulpit at St. Vincent's, what would he say to us as we approached an election? What would be the message of Jesus in our time? And I would like to suggest to you, it probably wouldn't be all that different from the things he would have preached in a synagogue along the shores of the Lake of Galilee. And what is that message? It's that you need to put the little ones of the earth first, that it's the poor in spirit, the meek, the lowly, the persecuted, the ones who hunger for justice and righteousness. These are the people we must pay attention to. It's to let the poor lead us out of ourselves and point us towards God. That, I think, is the challenge of Jesus' preaching, both in his age and it would be today. That there is a sort of upsetting logic to the gospel. That is, that the gospel asks us to think about the very people that oftentimes we avoid or overlook or just don't listen to. So also, I think the message of Jesus would provide us with a very clear direction for how to vote. And that is simply, we ought not vote simply on the basis of what's good for me or what's in it for me.
Ken, we're kind of get toward the end of this one.
Okay? It's basically a teaching that has grown and expanded in response to changing social realities. It'll continue to change. But the teaching consistently, it seems to me, of the gospel is that we ought not let ourselves be hijacked by any political party or any political movement, that our Christian faith, first of all, asks us to shape our attitudes and our values by listening to the neglected, the little ones, the overlooked in a society. The second group, besides ideas that are part of a strategy, are institutions. That is, how do we operationalize our ideas? And first here, I'd like to suggest to you that organized religion often broadens political participation rather than narrowing it. There are many lobbying groups that have religious motivations, both here in Albany, but also in other state capitals and down in Washington, D.C. In America, the vast majority of interest groups and lobbying groups represent the affluent and the well-educated. People like ourselves have enormous advantages in terms of getting our voice and our agenda up before our representatives. Whether it's the American Bar Association or the Association of Manufacturers or the American Medical Association or the American Federation of Teachers, there are all sorts of professional groups and organizations that get a hearing in our state capitals and in our national capital. Many of these groups have an influence far beyond their size in the population. But it's church groups and synagogues and mosques that frequently are the voice of the poor, the disadvantaged in these places. It's frequently religious groups that urge citizens to consider interests beyond self-interest. Church membership is far broader than the membership of an elite society. Involving the churches in getting the voice of the people out there and heard is one way of involving more people and different people than would be the case otherwise in our politics. Second, religion often equips people with the skills they need to act in public. Many church-based groups whether it's Pax Christi or Bread for the World or other groups, but also in our parishes, adult ed programs, Bible study, parish councils, Habitat for Humanity organizations. All these groups teach transferable skills to people. My father worked in the New York City subway system. He was a token clerk. He was one of the guys who used to sit in those little booths and make change for people and sell them tokens. To my knowledge, my father never spoke a word in a public meeting anywhere in his life. I never heard my father speak in public. My father, I'm quite sure, never gave an order to anybody at work. He took orders. He didn't give them. There are many people in those kinds of jobs and situations. Where are they going to learn about budgeting? Where would they learn about how to set the agenda for a meeting, or how to write a letter, or how to give oral remarks in front of a group of people, or how to get publicity for some purpose or cause? It's the churches very often that provide a network of places and gatherings and meetings that begin to teach people skills for acting in public that take away the churches. No other institution is going to help these people acquire those skills. The churches often provide people with a network of friends and associates that can be used to recruit volunteers for a purpose or a cause. The churches also give people information and insights about politics. Many Americans learn many of the skills for political activity in their workplace. But the trends of our workplace today all skew towards training managers, not ordinary workers, in these skills. It's religious institutions that provide a counterbalance and teach skills to a segment of the population that otherwise would be resource poor. A third point about institutions. Many religious communities like St. Vincent's are prominent as being people-sized institutions that stand between the lone individual and the giant institutions of big government and big business. Many people feel as if public life is mysterious. It's beyond their understanding and influence. It's religious groups that can serve to keep people engaged in a world beyond the immediacy of family, without being asked to somehow confront large and personal bureaucracies that overwhelm the individual and that actually discourage a sense of participation. Religious groups remain by far the most significant dimension of civic life in this country. It is the realm of life not governed by the rules of the marketplace, nor by the legal coercion of government. It's the churches, the mosques, the temples of local neighborhoods that foster a sense of society with people where they begin to think of people-sized institutions that can help them stand between the large impersonal associations of society and or being alone and being shut out. Finally, communities that support these many institutions. As we know, many of these institutions are at risk today. And one of the real tasks is developing communities like a St. Vincent's that provides volunteers, that provides people with talent and skills, that provides funding and other ways of assisting these more people-sized institutions, and provide, you might say, they become the entryway for people who otherwise would just be alone with their families or swallowed up by the big organizations and institutions. It's institutions like the churches that provide that kind of mid-level way of getting involved in public life. Changing structures. Here I'll just simply say, again, the point being that for many people, bringing about change happens much more easily when you do it through associations that are less impersonal and bureaucratic than much of big government or much of big business provides us with. Let me then move on to the next slide there, Dave. Church activity. What are we to do? Well, I want to just simply suggest 3 ways here to think about the church. Think about the church corporately. That is the institutional church. This is the church of, the chancery, the diocese. This is the church of the Conference of Bishops. This is the church of the Vatican, that level of church experience. Then there's the church as community. This is the parish or groups that are sort of similar to the parish. Maybe a retreat house and people who gather around there. Maybe a religious community of brothers or sisters or priests. Those kinds of people-sized communities. And then there is the church of individual believers, because there's a very real sense in which each of us as individuals is part of the body of Christ and represents the church. I think we need to keep those 3 levels clear in our minds, because activity that might be appropriate at one level would be entirely inappropriate at another level. So, for instance, at the personal level, nobody, I think, would be upset if in a conversation with one of you, I happen to tell you my view of one or another politician. And you might agree with me or disagree with me. You might sort of say to yourself, I kind of thought you were that way, but I wasn't sure. But it would be at times his opinion for what it's worth. But if Himes is not in a private conversation with you, but Himes is standing in the pulpit of St. Vincent's and starts espousing his views about certain politicians, then you might get a little more antsy about it. And about why is he doing that in this time and place? Because I'm no longer there just as a person. Now I'm speaking as the celebrant at the corporate liturgy, at the communal liturgy of St. Vincent's. I'm acting in a different way, on a different level of church activity. And even more so, I suspect we would be concerned if Bishop Schaffenberger was writing editorials in the Evangelist telling people this is how you should vote in the coming election. Then at that corporate level, we would simply say a bishop is not free to espouse his personal political views at that level when he's representing that level. If Bishop Schaffenberger is having a conversation over the phone with his friends and he says, I'm voting for so-and-so because I don't like so-and-so, people again might agree or disagree with him, but they accept that's Schaffenberger operating at the personal level in that conversation. When he's writing editorials in the Evangelist, he's operating at the corporate level. And so what I'd like to suggest to you then is that one of the ways we need to think about this is that it is the person at an individual level has considerably more freedom to act than someone acting at that communal level. And even at the communal level, we have greater freedom to act than at the corporate level. So perhaps the Justice and Peace Committee at St. Vincent's comes out with a statement about some legislation before the state assembly, right? You may or may not agree with what the Justice and Peace Council does, but you wouldn't be terribly upset because you don't identify the Justice and Peace Committee with the entirety of St. Vincent's. But if Elizabeth got up at all the masses and did this in her role as parish administrator, that's a different question. Now she's acting in a different way, and it's clear that she's speaking in some way or trying to speak as the leader of the community. And there, people who may disagree with her may feel as if their voice has been co-opted. So we need to think about church activity in terms of different levels of when we talk about the church. At the personal level, what we're talking about here is that how do we help people integrate into their self-awareness that being a citizen is in fact an important part of being a Christian, that there is a moral obligation to be an informed and active citizen as a Christian, because this is one of the ways in which you and I act out our faith. Just as we cannot divorce our identity as consumer or our identity as worker or manager at our place of work, we can't divorce that from our faith. By the same token, we cannot divorce our citizenship from our religious identity. We have to strive to integrate our religious values and beliefs into these other identities so that I'm a responsible consumer, I'm a responsible citizen, I'm a responsible parent of children, I'm a responsible agent in some organization or club that I belong to. All of these different roles that you and I play all have to be integrated with my religious beliefs. And so an integrated identity and spirituality is important so that we don't have this world of, oh, religion, that's over there on Sunday. But what I do Monday through Saturday has nothing to do with what I do on Sunday. The task is, how do we live an integrated life, not a bifurcated life? At the communal level, I'd like to suggest to you that one of the most important things that a parish can do at the communal level is to take seriously what is a good parish? To ask ourselves that question as people who go to St. Vincent's. For too many people, the test of a good parish remains, how well does the parish minister to me? Are the various ministries at St. Vincent, do they minister to me and my loved ones in a way that I find helpful? And if they do, then we judge, oh, I go to a good parish, or St. Vincent's is a good parish. But I'd like to suggest to you that the real test for any Christian community, not just St. Vincent's, for any Christian community, the real test is not how well does it do by me. The real test is, how well does it help me to minister to others? Is this a parish that calls forth my time, my talents, my goodwill, and puts them at the service of others? A disciple is not one who is served, but one who serves. Can our parishes be active centers of service where, when joining this parish, I get ushered into situations and groups of people that support me in being more generous and self-giving to others? That's the test of a good parish. Let's talk a bit about policy and morality. And here I'd simply like to suggest to you that these two realms of public policy and Christian morality, they are related, they need to be related, but they are not identical. Morality seeks the good, and in doing that, it appeals to consensus. It tries to bring people along. It tries to teach people what we think the values they should hold are. It tries to witness to those values and helps people to see whether or not this is a way of life, this is a lifestyle that we want to support and encourage and invite people to, right? Law operates differently. Law operates with, even in a democracy, we don't think of it in these terms sometimes, but even in a democracy, law is coercive. Law operates with the force of the state behind it, because it's not an option whether or not you obey the traffic laws. If you get pulled over, right, whether or not you want that ticket, whether or not you what the speed limit is, whether or not you like the attitude of the officer who pulls you over, the fact of the matter is, you get a ticket, you're going to have to pay, right? You're going to pay a fine. There's a coercive aspect to all law. Sooner or later, if you defy the law, you pay a price, financial or otherwise. And so therefore, the law has to always ask about when is it appropriate to coerce people, right? Granted, law does have an educational role. I don't want to deny that. Think about something that you and I all live through, which still to my day, to this day, surprises me, is the ban on smoking in public. I grew up in a time, and I'm sure many of you did, in which the vast majority of people smoked. And people smoked in restaurants, they smoked in bars, they smoked in closed spaces. The amount of secondhand and thirdhand smoke was incredible. And when laws came out barring smoking in public places, my first reaction is, you got to be kidding me. You think you're going to stop people from smoking in a bar? Never going to happen. I had been, and I will have to admit this, I had been in a lot of bars. And I thought to myself, I can't imagine the places I've gone to not having smokers. But it's happened. And what's happened is the law didn't just force people to behave a certain way. The law helped to teach people about the dangers of smoking, about the risks of second and third hand smoke. It was a teaching tool as well as an enforcement tool. So there is an educational role for law. Law can help to change people's minds, not just change their behavior. But generally speaking, if there is broad resistance to a law, then public policy is weakened. Just think of another ban that didn't work, the ban on alcohol in the era of prohibition. What prohibition led to, as all of us remember from our stories and movies and things we've seen about the Roaring '20s, right, was it led to the rise of organized crime. It led to the rise of a public health crisis because you had people making gin in bathtubs. You had people with their own private stills. You had people consuming alcohol that was being done under unsanitary conditions. You didn't know the origins of where this liquor was coming from. And eventually, the experiment was judged a failure, and there was the repeal of prohibition, simply because there was not a public consensus present to support the law. So morality, again, is always aiming for the good, but law sometimes has to settle for the possible. What will get a consensus of support? And that's why we have to acknowledge not all sin are illegal. We say lying under oath is a legal offense, right? You can be prosecuted for lying under oath, but you're not prosecuted for lying to your best friend. You're not prosecuted for lying to your spouse. You're not prosecuted by telling a tall tale at just sitting around the bar, right? Not all things that are wrong are illegal, because law restrains itself or restricts itself to those things where there is clear consensus in support of a law and where the law can be reasonably enforced. So again, we don't have laws against interior dispositions. You may hate somebody. You may have a streak of dislike for another person that just courses through your veins, and you can't stand another individual. You may actually wish them harm. But unless you actually do harm to the person, you're not violating any law. Law simply cannot get at people's interior dispositions. Yet, we're told by the Gospels that it's what comes out of a person that leads to their condemnation.
And
Interior,
we're kind of getting to the end of this one, I think.
okay, interior disposition is a huge part of morality, but it's not a part at all, hardly, about law. So policy and morality are two separate realms. And to say that something is wrong does not immediately translate into there ought to be a law against it. There's also the point about pluralism and compromise. And here I want to simply say a word on behalf of compromise. We live in a world, in a society right now in the United States, where compromise has almost become a dirty word because there's such great polarization within our country politically that now any sign that you're willing to cooperate or negotiate with someone on the other side of an issue, you're immediately, your loyalty, your integrity is questioned. You're challenged as to whether or not you really have beliefs. You don't stand up for what you believe in. And that is to confuse intellectual humility with relativism. Relativism is problematic. That simply says, well, you think this, I think that. What does it matter? Who knows? I give up, right? It doesn't matter what you believe. Intellectual humility is something different. Intellectual humility means you can have firm convictions, but we also have enough modesty to believe that there still is the possibility I could be wrong. There still is the possibility I may not have this right. And therefore, I need to listen to other people to see, is there something of reason? Is there something of insight? Is there something of wisdom in other views that I have not yet considered or that I have not sufficiently reflected upon? Intellectual humility is a virtue. It's not relativism. It's simply an acceptance that there are things I do not know, or there are things that I may think I know that I don't have full knowledge of, or that I don't fully appreciate some of the dynamics at work in addressing a situation. Also, and it was Thomas Aquinas who pointed this out back in the 13th century, there's a huge difference in having a conviction about something in general and having a conviction about something that's very specific. What do I mean by that? Simply this. If I said to you, everyone who works deserves fair recompense for their work, I think most of us would sort of say, yeah, I'm on board with that. That's okay. And then I might suggest to you, and fair recompense means they have to have a just wage, right? So that presumes that they're not working for themselves, but they're working for somebody else. And we have a wage system in the economy. You may have some doubts about the wisdom of a wage system and prefer another way of remunerating people. But most of you may go along and say, okay, I'm still with you, Himes. Fair wage for people who work hard. Then I may say to you, and the best way to ensure a fair wage is if we have a minimum wage law. We should put in a minimum wage law for all employees. Now, some of you may say, no, I'm not so sure about that. There are an awful lot of people who may wind up losing their job if employers are being told they have to pay a minimum wage for a job that really requires very little skill or very little effort or whatever it may be. There may be people who say, hey, look, a lot of people in minimum wage jobs are really teenagers working after school. They should be in a different pay scale than people who are trying to support a family and working 40 or 50 hours a week. In other words, now I'm going to get some people who are going to raise up, well, what about this case? Or what about that case? You're going to start having some dissenters from this position about we have to have a minimum wage law. And now let's say Hines comes out and says, and that minimum wage, let me be very clear, is $25 an hour. That's what you have to pay, right? Now a lot of people, whoa, I'm not going there with you on that, right? The point being, you see, as you move from the more general to the more specific, you always have to do so with a certain measure of self-doubt and a certain openness to hearing other viewpoints and other perspectives. It's one thing for me to say, every one of us here on this session tonight should be a peacemaker. We'd all probably nod our heads and say yes. But saying we should be peacemakers is a long way from saying, what should the United States defense budget look like? How much money should we allocate to the uniformed military? What should our strategy be in helping Ukraine or not helping them? What should we be doing in Gaza with the Israeli Defense Forces? Now you're going to start getting all kinds of different viewpoints and perspectives. All right. That's not being relativistic. That's not somehow, being wishy-washy. That's simply recognizing, as Thomas Aquinas did, that when you move from the general to the specific, you always do so with less certainty because you're making judgments about variable facts that can change and evolve over time and in different situations. You're making judgments about specific environments and questions in which people of good faith are going to say, that's not the way I read that. I have a different view of the history that led up to that issue or what we should be doing. Or I have some different knowledge about the sociology of the group we're talking about here. So pluralism and compromise, a necessary factor in politics today. Dave, let's go to the next slide. Let's say a word or two here about single issue politics. In light of what we've said before, just keep in mind, it's a world of difference if we're talking about single issue politics at the level of the corporate church or single issue politics at the level of individuals. You or I may feel very strongly about a given issue, and you cannot simply bracket that issue. This is simply your preoccupation in public life, is this topic or this issue. This is the thing that just is a burning issue for you. That's one thing as an individual to say, I'm going to vote on the basis of where candidates stand or whether or not that referendum supports or opposes where I am on this issue, which is all important to me. That's very different than the church at the corporate level saying, as the body of Christ, this is the only thing that matters to us, right? We have to recognize different levels of church are going to be allowed to have different levels of specificity when it comes to voting on issues. A second thing we need to keep in mind is the difference between principles and strategy. What I mean by that is, in the 19th century, as the issue of slavery was being debated in this country, there were many people who wanted to do away with slavery. There were many people who opposed slavery. But what they differed over was the strategy for how to abolish it. Whether it was to be done through a constitutional amendment, whether it was to be done through state legislatures, whether it was to be done over time, gradually restricting the importation of new slaves or the enslavement of the children of existing slaves, whether all slaves would immediately be set free, whether the people who held slaves would be recompensed for losing the financial impact of doing away with their slaves. There were debates about all these things. People may have disagreed with slavery at the level of principle, but at the level of strategy, there could be some real differences. When I was in college in the late 60s, many people that I knew, the overwhelming issue was ending the Vietnam War. That was what people were concerned about. And the first question that many people had about any candidate at any level, whether it was not just the presidency or even at the Senate or the House, it was about state assemblies or governors or lieutenant governors who had no role in foreign policy, and yet still where they stood on the war was the determining issue for many people. But as we all know, there were many people who thought the war had to come to an end, but there were a variety of strategies that were being proposed for how do we bring about an end to the war. And what some people were talking about was ending US involvement in the war, but not necessarily ending the war for the Vietnamese. Other people were talking about ending the war by defeating North Vietnam. Other people were talking about coming to a negotiated peace. There were all sorts of ways in which people might have had the same principle that they endorsed. Let's end this war. But the strategy being employed may have differed greatly, and people may have been on different places. Keep that in mind, because people may have a principle that they endorse, say about legal immigration, or say about abortion access. But people may have legitimate differences about the strategy for how to bring about that principle, how to enact that principle in public life. Is it always so clearly wrong for the church to refuse to be involved in single issue politics? Generally speaking, I would say yes. And I'll tell you why in a second. Generally speaking, I'd say yes. But here's what gives me a little hesitation. What if you were living in Germany in the 1930s, and the German bishops were debating whether or not they would come out with a statement that said no Catholic could support the National Socialist Party in good conscience? What if the German bishops took a principled stand against Adolf Hitler? Would that have been conceivably okay? Or would that still be, in our minds, illegitimate? Or what about if the bishops in South Africa during the apartheid era were to come out with a statement saying the single most important issue facing our country is doing away with apartheid? Would that have been so manifestly ill thought out? Or what if bishops here in the United States, especially, say, bishops in the southern United States, were to come out in the 1950s and say, the Jim Crow laws of this country have to end. Nothing matters more than stopping Jim Crow and segregationist legislation in our states. Those kinds of questions, at least for me, raise the intellectual issue of, is it always and in every case wrong that the church at the corporate level avoids single issue politics? Well, I would say 99% of the time, yes. But are there some cases that at least appear to be somewhat debatable or reasonable to propose? The reason for my reluctance in endorsing single issue politics at the corporate level is twofold. One is theological and one is political. Theological. The mission of the corporate church has to be to witness to the full breadth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Right? At the corporate level, the church's mission is to witness to the fullness of the gospel. And we need to be very wary of ever narrowing down that mission to reducing the gospel to this issue or that issue, this cause or that cause. As good, as legitimate as those causes and issues might be, might there be a place and a time at the corporate level that we simply have to say, as important as that issue is, the gospel is always more than about any single issue. Theologically, that's a concern I think we have to wrestle with single issue politics. The political question I think that has to be posed to single issue politics is this. There are multiple interconnections with any policy. It's very hard politically to isolate a single issue. That is, let's take the issue of abortion. One of the things we know now over the years is, surprisingly, abortion rates in the United States have generally gone down during the presidencies of Democrats, even though Democrats have been loudly supportive of access to abortion. Democratic presidencies, on average, since Roe v. Wade, have had lower rates of abortion than Republican presidencies. Why? Because the so-called liberal social agenda is arguably a pro-life strategy, because it provides women with some, at least minimally adequate, economic resources and alternatives so that carrying a child to term doesn't mean economic disaster for a woman. And so what we have found is that, in fact, trying to isolate abortion without seeing how it's interconnected with social welfare practices, with access to birth control, with other issues that are going on in the public sphere, you simply cannot isolate a single issue as if it doesn't have ramifications for other issues, and those other issues don't have ramifications for that single issue that you're focused upon. And so politically, it's hard to deal with a single issue in terms of legislation. And theologically, it's very questionable to reduce the gospel to too narrow a band of concern or priority. Let me say a word, and we'll end here, a word about candidates before us. And here I'd like to suggest that we think in terms not only of the individuals, what they espouse as terms of policies, but also character. Character matters as well as platforms. After all, often platforms, no matter whose platform, is stymied by the legislative process, or sometimes by judicial restraints. That is, it's very rare that a president or a governor at the executive level can simply dictate that we're going to implement the platform upon which they ran, because they run into legislators who have other agenda that they ran on and other interests that they're responsive to. And they also at times can run into judicial restraints where judges raise questions about certain proposed laws or policies or the processes whereby they would be enacted. And so to simply put all one's weight behind this candidate espouses this set of policies is to ignore the fact that it's highly unlikely that even with the best of intentions, a candidate is going to be able to fully implement their platforms. Character also matters. The sort of person that we're going to elect. And so I would suggest then that the real task before us is to recognize we may disagree with a candidate on certain issues, right? Immigration, about what the proper levels of immigration should be, how we're going to regulate immigration. But at the very least, we should say there cannot be an immigration law that's based on racism or that's based on some kind of nativism and fear-mongering. We may disagree in good conscience with a candidate about the right way to structure laws that have to do with the unique relationship of human life in the womb and the bodily freedom of a woman. But no just or moral policy can be built on the wholesale dismissal of any rights of the unborn. But within those broad realm of debate, there's lots of strategies, there's lots of policies that could be articulated that are not necessarily racist or fear-mongering in the immigration debate. And there's all kinds of policies and practices that can be discussed about abortion that are not necessarily based upon a simple dismissal of any value or worth to fetal life. So there are extremes that we can avoid, but there's plenty of room for negotiation. There's plenty of room for debate. There's plenty of room for honest disagreement among people. And what we need to be thinking about is not just the policies being espoused, but the character of the person. Is this a person with whom we could trust that they are acting in, as far as they understand it, the best interest of all people, the best interest of society, and not just their own self-interest, or not just their donors or their lobbying groups? What needs to be recognized up front is that, as Jesus taught us, we should be always looking out for the interest of others. That exists also in the realm of politics. And in particular, the others we should be concerned about are the least well-off, the least powerful, those who are truly on the margins of our society's concerns. It's up to us as religious people, as conscientious disciples, to keep trying to bring in from the margins and bring into the mainstream of public life the values and the persons that we think are being neglected or overlooked in our political life. But we do that in such a way that we don't simply insist we're the only ones who have insight into the truth. We're the only ones who have anything to offer or to say in public life. There needs to be that intellectual humility that recognizes there are others who may choose to act differently than I. And there has to also be on our part a recognition of the different levels within the church and what we can reasonably ask of corporate leaders, communities, and individuals within the church. So with that, why don't I sign off for now and suggest, Dave, we go to the discussion questions.
Okay. Yeah, the question is, do the distinctions between different levels of church activity make sense? Why or why not? Do you think it's ever appropriate to engage in single issue voting? Why or why not? So I will be putting those into the breakout rooms. Anyone has any suggestions or comments or things that they would like to mention or ask Father Ken at this point, I would open that up at this point.
Where are we? Where are we?
Just raise your hand and I'll call on you.
Where are we?
You're right there.
Let's see. Yes.
Go ahead.
Maureen, not Maureen.
Oh,
but I know.
yeah.
Okay, go for it.
No.
Yes.
The point you made, Ken, about we sometimes when we gather as a church, we think it's to nourish ourselves, but the idea of church empowering us to go outward and to serve others. Even though we do that, we forget that that's that's the nourishment of church. that fulfills us. It's not like we come to be like a battery charger, like the new chargeable cars.
Yeah.
It's the opposite.
Yeah. Kevin, it was a thing I had. It was an experience. I was only in parish work for 2 years in my life. It was when I was first ordained and before the community sent me back to do my doctorate. And I was in a parish in Jersey, and that's what I kept finding was I'd ask people and say, do you like the parish? Are you happy here? Is it a good parish in your mind and stuff? And they were great people. It was a working class parish in Bergen County, New Jersey, very ethnic, Polish and Italian largely. And I thought the people there were just wonderful. But the comments were always, "Oh, it's a good parish. You friars are very good to us," or "Oh, gee, my kids like the school," or "You have good programs for this or for that," or "You were very good in visiting my mother when she was sick in the hospital." Everything was on the basis of how they were being served by the parish.
Mm-hmm.
And on the one hand, it's nice to hear if you're on the parish staff, it's nice to hear that people think you're working well and you're doing things for them, and you're doing good. But I thought to myself, there is something wrong, because here we are constantly preaching about being servants for others, washing the feet of the other person, laying down your life for another. All the preaching and talk is about self-giving.
Yeah.
And all the standards for whether it was a good parish or not was self-serving. Mm-hmm. And after a while, I just said, there's something amiss here, and I think that that's still an issue in a lot of places. Is people are happy if they're being served by the parish, but the danger is, it seems to me, we become this kind of little cocoon, and we never kind of get out of the bubble into the wider society that.
And something that I think our parish does pretty well is involving children, because I think we always complain as Catholics that our kids don't stay involved.
Yeah.
And in a lot of parishes, I think it's because there's not a role for them. And I think of our Holy Thursday liturgy, where the kids are the water, they do the towels in the water, and we have sacristans who are children, and we just work hard at keeping.
We do. It's
our
still
kids
token. It's still
involved.
only a token.
But that's when you really become a Catholic Christian, is when you're serving, like you said, and we have to create roles for them to do that.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true, Maureen. And it seems to me that's why I've often thought a really interesting practice would be if, when you registered to be part of a parish, that not only do you have to put your name down and you get envelopes and all that sort of stuff, but you're given a list of, here's 30 organizations or 20 organizations in the area. You have to join one of them. And it's not necessarily our organizations in the parish, but there's the local branch of the Red Cross, or there's a group over here who are working with former prisoners, or there's a group here that's doing something with childcare, or whatever it may be. But if you were told to be part of this parish, you have to be involved in at least one agency that is a nonprofit agency involved in some service to the community. That's just comes with being a member of this parish.
Yeah.
That if you're in this parish, you're involved in the community. At least you find something that fits with your lifestyle, your interests, your skill set, whatever it may be. I think it would be a sort of interesting requirement that, to sign up to be a parishioner, you've got to sign up to be part of an organization that is concerned with the community.
Well, that's one of the
And I
things.
think you have to be careful of that, because you don't know what responsibilities other people have, in their home, or even if they aren't part of a family, I think you have to be careful, because then people can start judging other people if they're not involved in something.
Yeah, I think that's one of the wonderful things about St. Vincent's is that you get a sense that everybody's doing something. I mean, more than in most parishes. So yeah, I don't think it's a matter of saying, everybody has to do one thing or whatever. But there is that sense of responsibility, and we should be reminded of that. But I almost everybody I know is doing multiple, people we know. I don't know about you folks.
Anybody else have, yes, Jan? Yeah, you're muted. You're muted, Jan.
As a person who's new and comes from a different area, I would say that I've never belonged to a parish that had so many opportunities, and I have joined several different things. And but I've never had the opportunities where I lived. It just, church doesn't offer them, so the parish just doesn't have it. Where my mom lives in Massachusetts, there's nothing. She's just surprised at how much our church does. She's never heard of that. And when I lived in Mass, there wasn't anything like that. And when I was in New Hampshire, I mean, there was a few things. You could teach CCD. You could be on the parish council. You could be a lector or a Eucharistic minister. But that was pretty much it. There really wasn't a lot of things. The outreach that this parish has is amazing. So I think what this parish has is, and it draws more people in, is so many opportunities that you might find that niche. Like me, I would never be a Eucharistic minister. You couldn't get me. You couldn't pay me to stand on the altar and say anything. I would die. But can I work at the food pantry? You bet I can. Can I come to this? Yeah. Am I going to go walking with maybe Dave and other people next week? You bet I am. But that's more my speed. And then I'll get more bold and try to do more stuff. But I think that reaching out to all the people in all the different ways is amazing. It's amazing. I think this is an amazing parish. So that's just my.
We just have to get Father Ken to sing more.
Okay, let's have you sing more.
Anybody else have anything?
We're glad you're in it, Jan. Thanks for joining.
Anything else, Ann?
Let me just say that I think I met Christ the King, and many years ago we had a young priest here who never let two people pass each other without introducing them. And if he knew someone was involved in something, he would say, "Now, Mary, you know John, and he's working on this, and I think you'd be interested. Talk to each other." And he'd leave, and you were stuck. But people need to be invited.
Exactly.
And but in a parish like you're talking about, where your family is, if there's nothing going on, it's got to start with one person to say, "I want to do this, Father. Can I do it?" And probably he's going to say, "Sure."
We'd love to help. Come on now, we'll find something.
And I think people get complacent, and it's go to church, go by the rules, you go on Sunday and then you're done for the week. And that model is not what we're about. It shouldn't be. You should be challenged.
Not at this church, but where my mom lives, it is. That's what happens.
But
She's
if
a
she,
very good Catholic.
if she likes it where you are, as my mother-in-law did where we are, she went back and she started something at her parish at age 65.
Yeah, well, my mom's 87, so she's
Yeah.
making baby blankets. She started
Right.
doing that. I
Yeah.
ordered the yarn for her today.
Mhm.
So she can.
Anybody else have something they'd like to add? Jeff?
I want to say one quick thing. I think really we've been fortunate to have good parish leaders. I mean, for me, it started with Father O'Brien. He made it easy to want to join things because he called you out, just similar to what other people have said. He kind of just brought you in, and then you just gradually you became comfortable doing it. Initially you're a little uncomfortable, but then he made you comfortable. And then really any of the leadership we've had since Father O'Brien, it's been kind of the same way. They kind of have that same way of getting people to get involved and stuff like that. And, again, sometimes it's not comfortable to start, but once you get started and you start working with like-minded people and stuff, it just becomes easy, natural.
For sure.
Anybody else? I will close on this note. Actually, McKibben in his book, which we'll be discussing beginning next week in the chapter on the cross, critiques some churches, evangelical churches. He critiques of religion based on the replacement of a sense of community with a sense of hyper individualism. Basically, what Father Ken was saying, what does it do for me rather than what am I doing for the community and for the world and that sort of thing. And on that note, I will end this, and I thank you for your
We have to do-
involvement, and
well,
I hope to see some of you next week.
Dave, we have to thank Father Ken.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, Father Ken,
Thank you.
absolutely,
For
absolutely.
another free college course.
That-
Wonderful.
So much fun.
And